This is Land of Havilah, Jeremiah 23. In verses 1 to 8 coming up, Yahweh is incensed with wicked shepherds, not just in Jeremiah's time, but all time. Therefore, Yahweh will provide relief. He'll raise up a particular king who will deal wisely, a descendant of David, who will execute justice and righteousness in the land. Verse 1. Woe to the shepherds who destroy and scatter the sheep of my pasture, says Yahweh. Therefore Yahweh, the God of Israel, says against the shepherds who feed my people, You have scattered my flock, driven them away, and have not visited them. Behold, I'll visit on you the evil of your doings, says Yahweh. I'll gather the remnant of my flock out of all the countries where I have driven them, and will bring them again to their folds, and they'll be fruitful and multiply. I'll set up shepherds over them who'll feed them. They'll no longer be afraid or dismayed, neither will any be lacking, says Yahweh. Behold, the days come, says Yahweh, that I'll raise to David a righteous branch, and he'll reign as king and deal wisely, and will execute justice and righteousness in the land. In his days Judah will be saved, and Israel will dwell safely. This is his name by which he'll be called, Yahweh our righteousness. Therefore, behold, the days come, says Yahweh, that they will no more say, As Yahweh lives, who brought up the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt, but as Yahweh lives, who brought up and who led the offspring of the house of Israel out of the north country, and from all the countries where I had driven them. Then they'll dwell in their own land. Comment in verse 1, Woe to the shepherds who destroy and scatter the sheep of my pasture, says Yahweh. End quote. He was angry with the priests and leaders of Jeremiah's time. They were leading Judah straight into destruction. But the verse applies to all time. Woe to shepherds who scatter the sheep any time. In verse 2, Yahweh will visit on those shepherds the evil of their doings. Wicked shepherds, watch out. In verse 3, Yahweh will gather the remnant of his flock out of all the countries where he's driven them. Where has he driven them? From Jeremiah's perspective, it was 100 years previously that Syria and Edom took captives from Judah, 2 Chronicles 28, 5 and 17. And about the same time, the Assyrians took the northern kingdom totally into captivity, 2 Kings 17, 6. And according to Jeremiah's prophecy, Babylon is about to take what's left of Judah totally into captivity. And about 700 years after Jeremiah, the Romans would send the Jews again into captivity. But in verse 3, Yahweh says he'll gather the remnant of his flock out of all the countries where he's driven them. And we know Yahweh fulfilled that word by returning the Jews from Babylonian captivity. And in history after that, Yahweh's finally returned the Jews to the land again, just recently in 1948. And in the end times, God will gather his people again at the beginning of the millennium, Matthew 24:31 and 1 Thessalonians 4:17. And he'll gather them again when he establishes the new heaven and earth, Revelation 21:3. So it turns out that verse 3 is a general principle that if Yahweh scatters his people, he'll regather them. He won't let his people be permanently scattered. He calls us home. In verse 4, I'll set shepherds over them who will feed them. He fulfilled this by setting good shepherds over them when they returned from Babylon, men such as Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai, and Zechariah. And he's in the process of fulfilling it again today as Jews are softening to the gospel in Israel and elsewhere. And he'll do so again in the millennium. He'll appoint us to reign with him, Revelation 5:10. So Yahweh's heart is to appoint good shepherds over his sheep. In verse 5, Behold, the days come that I'll raise to David a righteous branch. The righteous branch speaks of Jesus. How do we know? First, Jesus is the only righteous person ever, 1 Peter 1:19 and Mark 10:18. And this branch is to David a righteous branch in verse 5, meaning he's a descendant of David, which fits Jesus also, Matthew 1:1. And in verse 5, the righteous branch will reign as king. Jesus is eternal king, 1 Timothy 1:17. So for all these clues, and because of other prophetic passages about the branch, Isaiah 4, Jeremiah 33, Zechariah 3, and Zechariah 6, the branch is no doubt Jesus. God will gather his people to the land and raise up the righteous branch of David to be king, to deal wisely and execute justice. And in verse 6, in the branch's days, Judah will be saved and Israel will dwell safely. This is starting to morph into a prophecy more restricted to the end times when all Israel will be saved, Romans 11:26. In verse 6, the branch will be called Yahweh our righteousness. Since the branch here is Yahweh, and we've already established the branch is Jesus, guess what that means? Jesus is Yahweh. In verse 7, of all Yahweh's miracles, the ones from the Exodus are the most famous. There were the 10 plagues, the parting of the Red Sea, God's fearsome presence at Mount Sinai, and so forth in the Exodus. When Jesus walked the earth, he did some impressive miracles, but nothing as flamboyant as the parting of the Red Sea. When he returns at the end of the tribulation and gathers us from the four winds, it'll constitute another Exodus. The miraculous nature of that Exodus will make the old Exodus pale in comparison. Talk about miraculous. All flesh and every eye will see Jesus when he returns in power and glory, Revelation 1:7. He'll send out his angels to gather his chosen ones. He'll establish his glorious throne on Mount Zion. The spectacle of all that will exceed the previous Exodus. No more will we say, as Yahweh lives, who brought up the children of Israel out of Egypt. But in verse 8 we'll say, as Yahweh lives, who brought the house of Israel out of the north country and all the countries where he had driven them. Verses 7 and 8 specifically name Israel, that the miraculous gathering that exceeds the exodus from Egypt will be a gathering of Israel. Other passages make it clear that this miraculous gathering of the millennium will be it'll be Israel in the holistic sense, meaning when Jesus gathers us for the millennium, it'll be believing Jews and Gentiles as one new man or one new race gathered to Zion with Jesus as king, Romans 11, Ephesians 2:15, and Isaiah 56, 3-8. Going to the next passage, Jeremiah says, verse 9, concerning the prophets, my heart within me is broken. All my bones shake. I'm like a drunken man, and like a man whom wine has overcome, because of Yahweh and because of his holy words. Comment Yahweh's holy word to Jeremiah is verse 10. For the land is full of adulterers, for because of the curse the land mourns. The pastures of the wilderness have dried up. Their course is evil, and their might is not right. For both prophet and priest are profane. Yes, in my house I've found their wickedness, says Yahweh. Comment verses 9-11, Jeremiah says, in effect, my heart is broken because the land is full of ungodliness. Yahweh told me about it. Even the prophets and priests are profane. In verse 10, the pastures of the wilderness have dried up, meaning Judah is spiritually dry. In verse 11, Yahweh found wickedness in his house. His house is the temple. Yahweh finds the priests who minister there to be wicked. Yahweh says, verse 12, therefore their way will be to them as slippery places in the darkness. They will be driven on and fall therein, for I'll bring evil on them, even the year of their visitation, says Yahweh. Comment in verse 12, Yahweh will pay an unpleasant visit to the prophets and priests. He'll make their way dark and slippery so that they fall. Now concerning what happened about 100 years previously in the northern kingdom, also called Israel and Samaria, verse 13. I have seen folly in the prophets of Samaria. They prophesied by Baal and caused my people Israel to err. In the prophets of Jerusalem I've also seen a horrible thing. They commit adultery and walk in lies. They strengthen the hands of evildoers so that no one returns from his wickedness. They've all become to me as Sodom and its inhabitants as Gomorrah. Comment in verse 13, Yahweh says, about 100 years ago there were false prophets in Samaria who followed Baal and caused the northern kingdom to go astray. In verse 14, it's the same in Judah and Jerusalem today. The prophets are adulterous in the sense that they make love with other gods, so to speak. They deal in lies. The situation in Judah is like Samaria, Sodom, and Gomorrah. Yahweh wiped those places out, and he'll wipe Judah out also. Coming up, wormwood is a bitter-tasting plant, verse 15. Therefore Yahweh of armies says concerning the prophets, behold, I'll feed them with wormwood and make them drink the water of gall. For from the prophets of Jerusalem ungodliness has gone out into all the land. Yahweh of armies says, don't listen to the words of the prophets who prophesy to you. They teach you vanity. They speak a vision of their own heart and not out of the mouth of Yahweh. They say continually to those who despise me, Yahweh has said, you'll have peace, And to everyone who walks in the stubbornness of his own heart, they say, no evil will come on you. For who has stood in the counsel of Yahweh that he should perceive and hear his word? Who has listened to my word and heard it? Behold, Yahweh's storm, his wrath, has gone out. Yes, a whirling storm. It will burst on the head of the wicked. Yahweh's anger will not return until he has executed and until he has performed the intents of his heart. In the latter days you'll understand it perfectly. I didn't send these prophets, yet they ran. I didn't speak to them, yet they prophesied. But if they had stood in my counsel, then they would have caused my people to hear my words, and would have turned them from their evil way and from the evil of their doings. Comment in verse 15, Yahweh says, I'll punish the false prophets. I'll feed them with the bitterness of wormwood and gall. He'll make the false prophets' lives miserable. In verse 16, Yahweh says, all you people, don't listen to the false prophets. They speak from their own hearts and not from me. In verse 17, the false prophets find their audience with those who despise Yahweh and walk in the stubbornness of their own hearts. The false prophets predict peace and safety. The people went wrong by despising Yahweh. Since they refused Yahweh, there was no replacement for Yahweh except falsehoods. Yahweh or falsehoods, take your pick. In verse 18, to escape deception, the essential thing is to stand in the counsel of Yahweh. Quote, who has stood in the counsel of Yahweh that he should perceive and hear Yahweh's word? End quote. In verse 19, Yahweh's wrath has gone out. Trouble is coming. In verse 20, Yahweh will stay angry until he's finished executing his wrath. Then, quote, in the latter days you'll understand it perfectly, end quote. So there'll be a time of confusion when the Jews will wonder why they have it so rough, but in the latter times they'll understand. In verse 21, Yahweh didn't speak to the prophets, but they were eager to prophesy anyway. In verse 22, again, he says, if the prophets had stood in my counsel, they would have heard me correctly. They would have relayed my word to the people, and the people would have repented. So it's a twofold problem of prophets who don't stand in Yahweh's counsel and ordinary people who don't stand in his counsel and make themselves susceptible. Going on, verse 23. Am I a God at hand, says Yahweh, and not a God afar off? Can anyone hide himself in secret places so that I can't see him, says Yahweh? Don't I fill heaven and earth, says Yahweh? Comment in verse 23, some mistake Yahweh as a local deity. They imagine he's at hand but not far off. The reality is in verse 24 that there's no place to hide from Yahweh. He fills heaven and earth. Verse 25, I have heard what the prophets have said who prophesy lies in my name, saying, I had a dream, I had a dream. How long will this be in the heart of the prophets who prophesy lies, even the prophets of the deceit of their own heart? They intend to cause my people to forget my name by their dreams which they each tell his neighbor, as their fathers forgot my name because of Baal. The prophet who has a dream, let him tell a dream, and he who has my word, let him speak my word faithfully. What is the straw to the wheat, says Yahweh? Comment in verse 28, there are wheat straw and wheat grains. Yahweh's word is grain, and false prophecies are straw. In verse 25, false prophets are an eager bunch. They love to say, I had a dream, I had a dream. In verse 26, they lie. Then according to how we read it, either they're deceived or they deceive, but probably both. In verse 27, they cause Yahweh's people to forget his name. Verse 29. Isn't my word like fire, says Yahweh, and like a hammer that breaks the rock in pieces? Comment in verse 29, Yahweh wants us to know his word when we hear it, so he gives us the defining characteristics of it. His word is like fire and hammer. If it's not fire and if it doesn't break rocks like a hammer, it's not him. Quote, isn't my word like fire, says Yahweh, and like a hammer that breaks the rock in pieces? His word isn't some namby-pamby thing like peace and safety when there is none. Verse 30. Therefore, behold, I'm against the prophets, says Yahweh, who each steal my words from his neighbor. Behold, I'm against the prophets, says Yahweh, who use their tongues and say, he says. Behold, I'm against those who prophesy lying dreams, says Yahweh, who tell them and cause my people to err by their lies and by their vain boasting, yet I didn't send them or command them. They don't profit this people at all, says Yahweh. Comment in verse 30, the prophets steal words from their neighbor. They jump on the prophetic bandwagon. They say what all the other prophets say. Jeremiah is to deliver the following hammer of a word, verse 33. When this people or the prophet or a priest asks you, saying, "What is the message from Yahweh?" then you shall tell them, "What message? I'll cast you off," says Yahweh. Comment in verse 33, when anyone asks Jeremiah if Yahweh has a message for them, he's to say, in effect, Yahweh's not speaking to you except to say he'll cast you off. Verse 34. As for the prophet, the priest, and the people who say the message from Yahweh, I'll even punish that man and his household. You'll say everyone to his neighbor and everyone to his brother, "What has Yahweh answered, and what has Yahweh said?" You'll mention the message from Yahweh no more, for every man's own word has become his message, for you have perverted the words of the living God, of Yahweh of armies, our God. Comment in verse 34, Yahweh will punish the false prophets and their household. In verse 35, when the Babylonians are pressing in, the people will say, everyone to his neighbor, "What's the word from Yahweh?" In verse 36, when it's over, they'll quit asking about Yahweh's word. The outcome will be the outcome. They'll ask about Yahweh's word no more. They'll learn the prophecies were false and lose their interest in getting prophecy anywhere and everywhere. Every man's word has become his message, which means they offer their own opinions and listen to each other, but not to Yahweh. When the Babylonians are pressing in, of course the people will take notice, and they will, verse 37. You'll say to the prophet, "What has Yahweh answered you?" and "What has Yahweh spoken?" Although you say the message from Yahweh, therefore Yahweh says, because you say this word, the message from Yahweh, and I've sent to you, telling you not to say the message from Yahweh, therefore behold, I'll utterly forget you and will cast you off, and the city that I gave to you and to your fathers away from my presence. I'll bring an everlasting reproach on you and a perpetual shame which will not be forgotten. Comment in verse 37, the people will ask the false prophets, what does Yahweh say about this invasion? How will it come out? In verse 38, the false prophets will give an answer with a supposed word from Yahweh, but for the reason that Yahweh forbids them to prophesy, therefore in verse 39 he'll cast them off for prophesying. He'll cast the city off for listening. In verse 40 he'll give them everlasting and perpetual shame. Jeremiah 24 is next.